Glad you're here for the Scientific Colloquium, and before I introduce today's speaker, let me mention the next two talks in the series. I think between today's speaker and the next two, we got an idea of just how diverse this series is. Today we're hearing about wildfire management. Next week, Ned Wright's going to be our speaker, and he's going to talk about infrared astronomy, exploring the universe with WISE. And then 2 weeks from today, we come back to Earth. Daniel Fisher from the University of Michigan is going to talk about Luba, a spectacular baby woolly mammoth from northwest Siberia, found frozen in the permafrost. So we've got lots of interesting talks coming up in the series. I hope you'll watch our website for this. Today's speaker is Mike Benefield. We're very happy he found us. He actually found us on the web because there was a talk in this series some years ago by a young firefighter, and he said, I can give a different perspective on that. And we decided it would be a good idea to hear that. Mike told me earlier today that he actually started off in biology. He's from Southern California, and he was studying biology and then working summers fighting fires, and decided he'd rather fight fires than do biology. And so he moved into the full-time work with the Forest Service for some 30 plus years, working for the Bureau of Land Management, where he is now a Zone Fire Management Officer in Moab, Utah, and I think he'll tell you a little bit more about his biography in a minute. But we're very pleased today to have Mike Benefield talking about the politics of smoke and the practical issues associated with the management of wild and prescribed fires in the West. Mike, welcome to Goddard.
Thank you, Dave. Like Dave said, my name is Mike Benefield. I'm a fire management officer with the BLM in Moab, Utah. And how many folks have been to Moab, Utah? You know, Moab's really just kind of a small town. It's funny to come to Maryland and say, yeah, how many folks have been in Hurleyville or whatever, you know? It's amazing how many people have been to Moab, and it's a beautiful place to work. It's just incredible. Yeah, it's fairly remote, but a nice place to work. I'm pleased to be at Goddard here today to speak with you about the practical aspects of smoke and as it pertains to wildfires and the fires that we light ourselves. My perspective basically, let's see if we can get this to work. My perspective basically comes from 33 years of working in the field of wildland fire management with various federal agencies in the West. And, you know, as you look that over, you know, it's just kind of the basic stuff of a career, but it also represents an incredible journey for me personally, and one that words really can't begin to describe. And I kind of wax nostalgic about it at this point in my career because within about a month I'm going to be retiring. So it's my knees are shot and pretty much used up from the career. But it's been a fantastic ride. First of all, I'd like to commend all of you also for what you do. I know, you know, you see pictures of us on TV fighting fires and whatnot. And, you know, there's always folks behind the scenes who are working real hard to make things come out right. And things don't just come out right by themselves. So I know in an organization like this, as complex as it is, that there's a lot of good folks working behind the scenes to make it come out right. And since I was a little kid, you know, watching the Gemini missions on TV, black and white, you know, folks at NASA have always been my rock stars, so I commend you all for that. That's right. That's correct. I'd like to thank Dave Thompson and for having me, and all the help he got from Lee Mushaw as well, getting me here. Here's the principal objectives that I'd like to cover for today. just overall, I want to give you a basic sense of what I deal with in regards to the complexity surrounding smoke and its impacts on the atmosphere. Also, that you might consider the things that I do from the practical standpoint on the ground, and think about the different missions that you folks are involved in. And maybe some way, shape, or form, we give each other some ideas about how one might help the other. So basically with that, one thing that's important that I'd like to point out is that we need to focus on, like I said, there's two basic types of fire that we're going to be discussing today. One is wildland and the other is prescribed. And there's an important distinction between those two, both within our agency and within the eyes of the law. Both of those denote certain things, and so we'll cover a little bit more about that, but the distinction's definitely important. There we go. Okay, when I think of smoke, I think of that old adage, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. But more than that, from my perspective, I also look at the idea that where there's fire, there too is smoke. Basically meaning that the behavior of a fire is going to determine the characteristics of the smoke at any given time based on the ignition and the fuels. So it's not, when we speak of smoke, it's a fairly complex issue based on what's happening on the landscape at the time. And the variables are endless as a fire moves across the landscape, both spatially and temporally. And so it's never really a static situation with regard to smoke. I'm going to show a quick film clip of the leading edge of a prescribed fire. And just watch this fire as it moves across the landscape. And this is a prescribed fire, so the conditions have been planned ahead of time. We have a general idea of the energy release of those fuels on the ground. We know that there's a wind blowing, so it's going to keep that fire fairly close to the ground and out of the canopy. The relative humidity is such that it also helps in that situation. But once again, the thing that you need to notice is that the amount and the characteristics of the biomass are going to determine how it burns there is going to determine how the smoke is produced. Okay, and this isn't quite the dramatic scene that I'm sure you're used to seeing when, you know, all hell's breaking loose down in Southern California and everyone's running for their lives. And, you know, the news media is saying, and the fire burned up an area the size of Rhode Island today, you know, and you're thinking to yourself out west, you know, why Rhode Island? You know, why do they keep measuring everything by Rhode Island? I've never been there, but it's like the license plate should say, you know, Rhode Island, America's wildfire yardstick or something. So, I don't know. Just one of those things. But like I said, there you go. But basically, getting back to the fact there's two types of wildfire. And here we have an example of the wildfire, and I'll let you look at the definition there. You know, within the context of firefighter safety and economics and access, being able to get at a fire, you know, it comes down to, with the case of a wildfire, we have to put it out. We have to put it out in the most cost-effective and safe manner. So, I mean, that's fundamentally what a wildfire is all about. I'm sure I have someone here, probably at the MODIS program, to thank for this beautiful picture from outer space of that fire right there. That was a fire burning in the Central Oregon Cascades back in 2003. And why I know that is because on the specific date that this picture was taken, I was underneath that smoke column there as the incident commander at the time that this was being taken. Incident commander is like the fire boss. And there's actually two fires burning there, as you can kind of see by the signature. And the issue there on a day like that was that the column, what we had there was an area that hadn't been burned in recorded time since people had been in that part of Oregon. Heavy tonnage of fuel on the ground, kind of a subalpine fir spruce environment. And basically, the ignition component of our fire behavior calculations basically stated that 98 out of 100 embers that would hit the ground would ignite. And I would think that the way it was, the behavior actually was, is I would say probably more than that. It was almost every ember that hit the ground was starting another fire out of this smoke column. And with that, the resistance to control was incredible. We had people trying to be evacuated out of there, driving down Santiam Pass, flames on both sides of the road, soccer moms with kids, and it was just pandemonium. And add to that, we had President Bush, who was there for a visit in that part of the world, I think speaking about healthy forests or something like that. And so there was that dynamic going on. And I couldn't fly air tankers or any kind of aircraft because the smoke wouldn't allow me to do that. And I had about 5 news crews, which was about 4 more people in number than I had for fire line supervision. So the firefighters that were showing up had no one to lead them. So it was kind of like they're standing down waiting for leadership. And so that's what the news cameras were looking at. Well, why aren't these guys doing anything, you know? So needless to say, it was a bad day to be Mike Benefield as the incident commander. So that's a wildfire. And notice how the smoke is dispersing out, not just in the local area there, but it's affecting a regional area at that point. You know, smoke's going across highways and dispersing far and wide. So more than just our area to consider. Okay, the other type of fire that we're going to talk about that has a different connotation is the prescribed fire. And you'll look at this and you think, holy moly, that does not look like a prescribed fire to me. That looks wild. And the deal is note the definition on that. Kind of gives you an idea a little bit about the prescribed fire. Now this photo was taken on the district I'm on now. This is a few miles downriver along the Colorado River from Moab. And basically, once again, this is all going on just according to plan without a hitch. This burn unit was about 25, 30 acres in size. Basically, once again, the amount and characteristics of the biomass emissions is determined by the fire behavior at the time of ignition. And in order to do what we wanted to do there, which, you know, fires are determined by topography, weather, and fuels, basically. And in this case, the fuels is invasive species known as tamarisk, which was introduced to the Southwest about roughly 100 years ago to combat erosion. And some people thought it was a nice little bush. And so it's basically become a monster. It's followed along the riparian areas, blocking out native vegetation like cottonwoods, things like that. You can't get at the river because it forms like almost a solid wall. And when it burns, it has volatile oils and things in it, as a lot of species that are adapted to drier climates do. And it burns like that when it catches on fire normally in the summertime. So here we're lighting it, and it's doing its thing, and that black smoke there is just kind of a component of those conditions plus the fact of what sort of vegetation it is that we're burning. Notice, just put yourself in the position, this is a prescribed fire, and it's burning under normal summertime conditions, probably about 95 degrees there with 8% humidity and a little bit of wind. And imagine yourself out on the family excursion around Moab in the old Subaru, and you come around out of a box canyon, and there's the road you have to go down. So just for strictly the public safety standpoint, there is a potential there for that. We had people actually along the riverbanks, you know, people love water. They like to camp close to the water. There was people who had actually tunneled back in different places and made their own little campsites right in the middle of that mess there. So you could imagine if we got a fire that started suddenly from a campfire or whatever and started to spread through that stuff, it would have been a bad situation. We're slowly getting in there and at least trying to knock some holes in it so we break up the continuity of it. It's a full-time job, and it's turned out to be quite the mess. Okay, in regard to my perception of dealing with smoke from my level in the food chain, we have to talk about risks and perceptions of risks, and put yourself in the place of a wildland fire manager with regard to wildfire versus prescribed fire, an act of God versus a deliberate act. This is also includes two modes of introducing smoke into the airshed: an uncontrolled release through wildfire, or more managed release through prescribed fire. Now there's levels of risk with each one of those, but I'll chat a little bit and get into that as far as what that means. The distinction here between the two types of fire is our ability to select the timing, the placement, and the conditions under which the ignitions are going to happen. This allows fire managers to use a wide variety of tactics and strategies to help at least have some sort of control over timing and amount of smoke and intensity of fire, all of those things. And we can kind of control the smoke through some of those methods.
Where is the picture?
Let's see. Which one?
One on the previous image.
As far as?
Where is it? City. It's a city.
Oh, where is that? I'm sorry. I think that's out of Phoenix. That picture right there? Yeah. That's a very good picture. I like that. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about wildfires. And, you know, we see wildfires all the time on TV. And it's almost like they're according to script. I mean, it's the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, the only thing that seems to change in the pictures of people running for their lives and whatnot is the year of the automobile. You know, back in the Bel Air fire, it was rigs from the 1960s, so on and so forth throughout the time until now. We're still dealing with this urban interface issue, and it's just sadly like clockwork. Happens all the time. Managers, when we're dealing with wildfires, we have a certain amount of risk just because we're dealing with a wildfire. The political risk, we even have a little bit of political risk in dealing with wildfires. But overall, we're still kind of the good guys there to help control an act of God or a situation that we're trying to do the best we can with what we have to bring some sort of control to chaos. And because many of the areas that we're dealing with are outside their natural range of variability with regard to fuel loadings now, we're dealing with fires that are a lot more intense than what we've seen in the past. It's pretty incredible what we're seeing out there now. The size of the fires is getting bigger. Their resistance to controlling is getting bigger. You know, and there's also increased costs with mobilization, and the overall suppression costs around $1 billion is what is being appropriated a year for fire suppression. And so we have some real questions and we have to ask each other about the nature of it and how we're going to deal with it. There's also increases to the amount of soil damage that's being done out there, resource damage, because of the degree, the intensity of these fires we're starting to see. Some people have called them mega fires. And also to infrastructure out there, just anything from transmission lines to whatever people have put out there, cell towers, important pieces of infrastructure. So, But finally, what we're looking at in relationship to the bigger topic here is the release of this sequestered carbon into the atmosphere that's been sitting there building up all this time. It's like a big release suddenly from these things. And the columns are getting up higher into the atmosphere depending on the fuel loading. So in the end, fire managers have emissions to consider and then potential emissions of what's laying out there on the ground to consider. Okay, and this brings us to prescribed fire and the fact that the personal risk to a fire manager is increased when we're the ones deliberately lighting the fire. It isn't an act of God. We can't blame it on somebody else. It's us lighting, we're initiating the action. And as you can see, burning's a lot more complex when we light it ourselves. You know, NEPA and other planning, we plan, it takes a year or so to pull off a burn. Just with the sort of planning. NEPA planning, we have to bring all the specialists in. They have to look at the piece of real estate and say yay or nay, and we have a discussion on, okay, what's the impacts? This is the sort of fire I want to see out there. This cultural resource over here, an old Anasazi village, I don't want that fire anywhere near that. Okay, but then the other question comes up that we throw back is, okay, you've got a pinyon juniper stand that is completely inundated this Anasazi village. And if there's lithic material in there, there's going to come a time that this burns. You know, if we don't do something about it, whether it's a mechanical treatment to maybe trim around the Anasazi village that's in ruins buried underneath a pinyon juniper stand, or, you know, there's a possibility lightning could get started in there and, or a fire could get started and we have fire damage to an irreplaceable resource. So these are things that we hash out, and sometimes we can get kind of heated in our planning sessions. We also have to adhere to the Clean Air Act and the EPA guidelines on national ambient air quality standards. But with solid planning, these emissions can be managed. You know, you have to have experienced folks that follow their burn plan, that do a lot of preliminary planning, and follow what the burn plan says. But basically, you know, the prescribed fire smoke is fundamentally, it's created deliberately by us. And there are times when a prescribed fire can go terribly wrong. And when a prescribed fire goes terribly wrong, usually out of something that, you know, is beyond our control, but sometimes there's issues. Humans are humans. And there's times when a fire manager really thinks seriously that maybe being a greeter at Walmart is better than the job he's doing right now. So case in point was the Cerro Grande fire in New Mexico out of Los Alamos in 2000. You know, and the consequences of a prescribed fire going wrong can literally end careers. So if you show up to work one day and it's not your day and something bad happens, like the burn boss here that worked for the Park Service that ignited the fire at Cerro Grande and made decisions along the line which to him seemed to work fine. We had weather conditions come in, it changed the whole variable, the situation of the variables. It was not a good day. It can end careers and can leave the burn bosses with a profound sense of guilt. If you could imagine being the burn boss on the fire that went into Los Alamos and ended up threatening Sandia National Laboratories. So there isn't many jobs that have the potential to influence national politics or the actions of the President of the United States. So, you know, I've often heard it, the fire manager can shut down a major airport by just restrictions of air traffic as far as air tankers and aircraft. when things are burning. There's an incredible responsibility that comes with that position, and the same with a burn boss. And it's not only the actions, the direct actions of the fire burning on the ground, but it's the implications of the smoke. You know, the smoke's having impacts to the population as well. So, you know, the burn boss at Los Alamos, I'm sure, would have much rather been the incident commander and the hero than the burn boss and the villain. So, but that was a decision consciously made. It was a deliberate act, and followed by following a burn plan according to a protocol. Okay, so this is a slide of a, this is from smoke from a wildfire in Alaska, I believe it's Fairbanks. And it also lists some of the factors that we need to consider whenever we use fire. And we'll consider each one of these things. You notice that smoke there. That's a real characteristic of boreal forest burning up north in Alaska or Russia. They give off this real dense smoke. There's a high density of fuels that's burning, varying levels of moisture in the fuels. And so it's kind of a smoldery, there's smoldery type burning interspersed with these big impulses of crown fires. So that's what you end up with as far as from a smoke standpoint. Okay, at the local level, you know, in the first case, if you were a burn boss, as far as age and the condition of health and the instances of respiratory disease in the population, where do you think it'd be easier to pull off a burn? South Florida or someplace in Nevada? You know, obviously, someplace in Nevada would probably be easier from a human health standpoint. But it's also, in the second case, it's interesting to note that within cultures, even within the population of the United States, there's varying degrees of tolerance to smoke based on culture. There's places in Appalachia where it just isn't normal if smoke's not in the atmosphere, in the air, certain times a year, because the conditions are right for burning, and those folks are still connected through burning. They burned like their parents burned before them, their dad burned before them, for all different kinds of reasons. And, you know, some could be to make their hunting area a little easier to get around in, or to kill ticks, or all sorts of reasons, but passed down through the generations. And so when they see smoke, you know, they aren't going to necessarily call the fire department. You know, maybe it was them that lit it. But the bottom line is that there's cultural tolerance, and depending where you're at, like for instance where I came from in Southern California, you know, we had an adverseness to fire. We were just taught to fear it for obviously good reasons, and there was not really a season for fire in order to use it on the landscape in Southern California. All there was when the Santa Anas came up, all hell broke loose, you know, 9 times out of 10, and that's what we saw. And so, you know, we didn't leave fire unattended. We never turned our back on it. And that's what we were taught. It'd be unheard of. And so with that kind of cultural background about fire, if you saw smoke, you'd call the police or call the fire department, and you would be very aware of just not interacting with it much. As a fire manager and growing up in the organization and learning what I've learned about fire, you know, I realized my relationship to it has changed. I've seen how it works on the landscape, just as a part of the landscape, as a function of nature. And so I respect it, but I don't fear it like I did when I was growing up. But with regard to the last thing, the relationship with the local population, in order to pull off a burn, if you have a population that's fairly averse to fire, you have to educate them. You kind of have to bring them along, and that can be hard. From our roots in the places we've come from culturally to this country, especially Europe, Northern Europe, fire was something not to be tolerated. and it wasn't. So we came to this continent here with the idea that only good fire's a dead one. So it's a matter of us, in order to have some acceptability putting fire on the ground, we need to involve the local population, even to the point where in some places where I was a fire manager in Central Oregon, we actually got ranchers involved in the process. So we'd sit down at a map, draw boundaries on the ground with regard to where the fire was going to be, our prescribed fire, and it would cross part of their land along with our land. And because it followed a road, it was the cheapest way to implement prescribed fire on the ground. Plus, the larger a prescribed fire, the more cost-effective it is. Little prescribed fires are expensive. Big ones, not so much. Yeah. Okay, more with regard to risks at the local level. Generally, fire's proximity to people is where the risk is. You know, if a fire burns in a wilderness and people don't even see the smoke, don't know where it's coming from, and there's a lot of other smoke going on, you know, maybe not so much of a problem, you know, out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But a lot of times that same distance and being remote can also work against fire managers, because we have just that much more problem accessing the fire, to control the smoke, to control where the fire burns, to cut off heavier chunks of fuels that maybe we don't want to burn because of smoke issues. So if you have a hard time getting at the fire, that's going to have an impact on the smoke that's produced. Okay, and along with fuels and topography, weather's a major factor in consideration of the risk. Out in the West, you know, people basically live in the valleys. But where we burn is usually up in the mountains. And so what we have to keep in mind, and it's just the basic laws of physics, warm air rises, and hopefully that warm air will take our smoke under the right conditions, get it up to the transport winds, and move it out of the area. So it isn't impacting local populations. By the same token, cool air sinks. So while we might just be looking dandy, burning along, you know, all of a sudden night comes, and the diurnal winds take the smoke on down the hill into the valley, you know, where the people are, and across highways and whatnot. And so, you know, we got to be mindful of just what the weather and what the atmospheric conditions are when we're dealing with smoke. Stable air, poor venting, smoke's not going to go anywhere. In fact, you get inversions. That's the last kind of conditions we want to burn under. But those are usually pretty safe conditions as far as trying to control a fire. Doesn't give you too much issues when you're under a stable air mass.